All right, everyone, welcome to the Calibrate show. This is part 2 in my new place. I love it here. It's very peaceful. We're going to talk about Antiochus IV today, so stick around after the bumper. Welcome back. I have already gone to the next slide from the title page. Reason being is I'm ready to get started for this. So before I go, let me introduce this topic in a sense that it's debated, okay? Daniel 11, and really the entire book of Daniel, has a lot in it that's debated by, well, everyone. You've got religious scholars, you have atheist scholars, and even they all disagree in different ways about this whole book. I probably should have even said this in the first part, but today we're going to talk about Antiochus IV. There are many who believe he has already fulfilled all of the prophecies of Daniel. I've met people who have said, all of prophecy's been fulfilled already, right? I think you'll find out today that that's not the case. But what you'll also hopefully find out through watching this video, if you haven't watched anything about this man yet, is that he does indeed fulfill a lot of prophecies. But when it comes to biblical prophecy, one fulfillment doesn't mean it's over. There is an ultimate eschatological, or as you would say, an end times fulfillment over all of this. We're going to get into this today. We're actually going to do a little bit of recap starting in verse 20. We went through verse 20 in our last video. We also talked about verse 21 briefly. But in verse 20, hopping in his place, this is Antiochus III or Antiochus the Great. I might need to raise this. I feel like I'm leaning down to look at you guys. Hope that's better. If not, oh well. It's not really about me. It's about Jesus. So, in his place, this is Antiochus the Great, the third. One will arise. This is talking about Seleucus IV, who will send out a tax collector for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days, he, Seleucus IV, will be broken, though not in anger or in battle. And as I've said in part 1, you'll hear me say it, this is exactly what happened. Antiochus the third, was in war in Greece to defend a lot of the Grecian states. They had asked him for help against the Romans who were expanding eastward. He doesn't win, and he ends up owns Rome a huge debt, including his son, Antiochus IV. Now, eventually what happens is Antiochus III, he gets assassinated. He attempts to steal money, and I got to correct this. I said Temple Baal. That's not what I don't know where that came into my mind. I think I was thinking ahead to Zeus, which we're going to talk about today. But he actually was the temple in Jerusalem. He tries to steal money, but instead what happens is he gets assassinated. And so fast forward a good 10 years or so, where the new king, Seleucus IV, he also sends someone to collect wealth from the temple. But instead, the person he sends, who is seen here as Commander Heliodorus, instead comes back empty-handed and assassinates Seleucus IV. They make it like he mysteriously passes away. In his place, who has now returned from Rome, and the reason he returns is Seleucus IV's son, Demetrius, is sent to Rome. He replaces Antiochus. The reason being, as per the agreement, the Romans wanted the king's son, not a nephew, not a cousin. They wanted the son. So Demetrius is now in Rome. Antiochus IV has now returned. In the last 10 years of his time in Rome, and you'll see this come to play, he learns about Roman culture, Roman politics, and Roman tactics, military tactics, and he becomes very astute in all of these. Let's start with verse 21 to 23. In his place, again, it's talking about Seleucus IV, a despised person will arise. Some translations would say contemptible. Others would say vile or immoral. He's not a good person. Royal honors will not be given to him, but he will come during a time of peace or speaking peace. He's a politician. and he will seize the kingdom by intrigue. A flood of forces will be swept away before him. They will be broken, as well as the covenant prince. After an alliance is made with him, he will act deceitfully. He will rise to power with a small nation during a time of peace. He will come into the richest parts of the province and do what his fathers and predecessors never did. He will lavish plunder, loot, and wealth on his followers, and he will make plans against fortified cities, but only for a time. I have here a picture of the map. I'm hopefully out of the way. I'm covering, I think, mostly Saudi Arabia is what my mug is covering now. But as we said, the mysterious death, Seleucid IV, would raise up Antiochus IV in his place. He would come to, using the statecraft we talked about, becoming an astute politician. He knew how to schmooze people. Schmooze is a word I've heard another teacher use, but he knew how to play the game. And he ends up becoming friends with the fella in Pergamon, which I added to this map. Pergamon's like big black dot. It's not the exact location of where Pergamon is, but it's basically in modern day Turkey. Towards the middle, maybe a little closer to the coastlands. But he would use this agreement and use this relationship with Pergamon and use this military from him, and he would swiftly invade down towards Antioch, which is there on the map, that little white dot. Keep the location of Antioch in mind, because in part 3, this is really going to come about. It's a very important location for what we're going to discuss in the future concerning events in Syria. Think Idlib province. Back to Antiochus, in his early rise to this power from Pergamon, he would face some opposition, but nobody would expect him to basically take that throne from Pergamon and in a way, and I don't know if the algorithm, it's a technical term, I guess, a blitzkrieg of that time, which I would suggest is kind of what he does here. He goes straight to Antioch, besieges it and controls it, and secures his rule of the Seleucid kingdom, or the kingdom of the north. Now, as you read in the next slide, at the prophecy at the top, starting in verse 25, with a large army, he will stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will prepare for a battle with an extremely large and powerful army, but he will not succeed because plots will be made against him. Those who eat his provisions will destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall slain. The two kings whose hearts are bent on evil will speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for still the end will be at the appointed time. So it's still not happening yet. The king of the north will return to his land with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action and then return to his own land. Once again, this is exactly what happens. Antiochus IV, with his early success taking the Seleucid kingdom, raises the alarm of Ptolemy VI, and he begins to raise this large army to confront Antiochus. But Antiochus IV, being an astute politician with his ear to the ground, caught wind of this. He had early warning, or maybe he suspected this beforehand, because, and speaking of him breaking agreements, making agreements, speaking peace, and then breaking them, he breaks the Roman agreement, the one that has Demetrius over in Rome now, that replaced him. And he raises a large navy, and he ends up, it doesn't show here on the map, but he ends up taking control of the port of Cyprus. He heads to there with his navy, and then heads straight to Egypt. Meanwhile, he leads his army. Here in this map, I might make it big here when I go to edit, but on the straight, bold line, not the dotted one, but the bold one, it's his first campaign to Egypt, and he overwhelms Ptolemy VI. He takes all their major cities, takes Memphis, and takes Alexandria. He takes everything. However, there's this other nation that he's now familiar with, and that's Rome. And in order to not alarm Rome, he sets up Ptolemy VI as a co-regent of the kingdom of the south, along with his brother Ptolemy VIII. The plan of Antiochus was to set himself up as some kind of hero and protector of Ptolemy VI, making himself look more appeasing to Rome and to his own people. He dresses himself as the one with the answers. There's so many politicians and dictators throughout history and even today that do this very thing. We're dealing with some of that here in our nation, the United States. I'm not going to put any names out there. I'm going to do my best to stay away from politics as much as I can, but you're going to see eventually that's going to come into play in the future in some of these videos. Again, returning to this topic, one last thing before we move to the next slide. The nation of Egypt, and where Antiochus comes up with this plan, he doesn't come up with it out of thin air. See, Egypt at the time was already dealing with some civil conflict between these two brothers that we've been talking about, Ptolemy 6 and 8. Ptolemy 6 being the older brother and the rightful ruler according to their laws, having issues with the younger brother, who also, I guess everyone wants a little taste of power. You give a mouse a cookie, they want a glass of milk. That's my loose understanding of what's going on in Egypt. Antiochus is essentially taking advantage of that. However, his plan would backfire. As you see on the picture, Gaius Popilius Laenas says, back off. So what ends up happening in this backfiring of his plan is Ptolemy VIII, the younger brother, ends up swearing allegiance to his older brother, unifying the kingdom of the south. And this, again, alarms Antiochus. He comes out of his kingdom of the north, and as it says here in Scripture, he comes back to the kingdom of the south, but he gets opposed. I'm going to go back to the map. I might just put it on here real quick. Or we go back a slide, who knows. The dotted line is now the second route Antiochus takes. He pretty much does a lot of the same stuff. It's even easier for him. He takes Gaza, Raphia, what's that? Reno Karura. I'm not going to say the rest of these names. He goes through the same steps, takes the same cities, goes back to Alexandria, only this time, as it says in Scripture, ships from Kittim, or Western powers. Now, why is this not saying Rome? Well, if you put yourself, once again, going back to the map, in the feet, I might just throw a map up here and block my face off while I'm talking about this. I should have had it on here already. But if you're looking from the location of Israel and you're looking out west, the first thing you're going to see, one, is the ships of Kittim. But also, Kittim, in my loose understanding of this, would be brought over from the coastlands, or what the ancient Hebrews would call the coastlands or the coastal regions. This would be the Greek islands, the Grecians, Sparta, Athens, and Rome becoming part of this whole concept. And this will come into play in future days, and probably at play now. And we'll get to that again. But this is where we get the famous, if you remember anything about high school history when you study the ancient world, the famous line in the sand, or the circle drawn around Alexandria, where Antiochus, in the midst of getting ready to succeed a second time, the Ptolemies have now, they've reached out to Rome and they're asking for help. Well, they send that delegate, the Roman leader that I said earlier, I'll just call him Gaius. He pushes back with a message towards Antiochus IV that tells him to leave Egypt or consider yourself in a state of war. Well, Antiochus IV he would try to stall, tell them, hey, let me talk to my council, guys. Let's hold up a bit. Whoa, we don't want to get this way out of proportion. We don't want things to escalate. Sounds like people today. Let me talk to my council and I'll get back to you. Well, in direct response and speedily, Gaius tells him, he says, look, here's a circle around Alexandria where you are. If you leave this circle without an answer, consider yourself at war. In other words, we're not playing this with you, Antiochus IV. We can't afford the region because Western powers at Rome, they had relations in this whole land. They're already doing trading. They're the economic hub, and they're basically not even to defeat Antiochus IV, just simply go back to where you came from, stop, or consider yourself at war. Well, Antiochus IV heeds the warning. He heads back with his tail tucked between his legs, and this is where we see the what's already in him, this satanic hatred for God and his people, and his covenants with his people and the land itself, that what's really in him, who he really is, comes to full bearance. In other words, the mask is lifted. The humiliation, the frustration, the defeat, combined with this, speaking of a beast that you talk about in the book of Revelation who receives a head wound, or seemingly receives a head wound. There is if you read the book of Maccabees and some of the other historical writings around these events, there's a rumor that happens in Israel about Antiochus IV being assassinated or unalived, as many YouTubers now have to say. And the rumor was something about his head. Of course, it was just a rumor. And during this rumor, there was a revolt. So there's Israel at this time is split into two. It has a northern and a southern kingdom as well. And you have two high priests that are vying for power. I forgot to say the guy's name. I have it on here. Menelaus, who was an implant from Antiochus IV. Well, when rumor was going around that Antiochus IV was no longer around, if you hear the bus in the background squeaking their brakes, Jason, who was also a priest in Israel, would lead a revolt and oust Menelaus and would rededicate the temple. And when all of this gets back to Antiochus IV, who has already been humiliated by Rome, he becomes enraged, which would lead us to the interim or even partial fulfillment of the time of Jacob's trouble. This would be the fulfillment of this generation. There's another one coming. It's not hateful to say that. You have to be honest with people if you love them. Enter the desecration of the temple, the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. The past fulfillment of this, and we'll get into the future fulfillment eventually. But starting in verse 31, his forces will rise up and desecrate the temple. This is where some people who are more historical, not necessarily preterists, I'll stop it here for a second. The previous verses we just went through, some believe that Antiochus IV does all that, but starting at this point, it's actually about the Antichrist. And then you have some who believe it's about both, that's me. And then you have some who believe it's only about Antiochus IV. As we continue to go through this, you'll see that definitely that last position is not the case. So his forces will rise up and desecrate the temple fortress. They will abolish the regular sacrifice and set up the abomination of desolation. Remember, if this was all past, Jesus quotes this hundreds of years later and places it in the future. Just keep that in mind. Paul does the same thing in 2 Thessalonians. With flattery, he will corrupt those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will be strong and take action. All right, so when he already occupies Jerusalem. When he comes to the temple, he sets up a sacrifice. He sacrifices a pig at the altar, which is just, if you know anything about Jewish tradition, that's one of the highest blasphemies. He erects a statue of the god Zeus. I put him here in the bottom left corner of this video. If you notice anything about the way Zeus is always depicted in ancient literature and mythology, and here in this picture, he's pictured as one with white hair in the clouds, or at times riding the clouds, controlling the lightning and the weather, and he is the supreme god of Greek mythology. Who does that sound like? It sounds like the god Baal in the Old Testament. It's the same deity at work and at play that it was in the Old Testament that it is now. It's the same satanic resemblance, trying to be like God, because as we read, and we went over some in the sixth seal, as we read in other places in Scripture, Jesus returns with white hair, shining like the sun, riding the clouds, and controlling the weather. It's a direct confrontation with this ancient deity who is always trying to usurp the throne. That's something we need to always keep in mind when we get into our future videos. Now, he would also sit, Antiochus IV, would also sit on the seat in the temple and would declare himself, give himself the name Epiphanes. You ever heard of the term, the phrase, I had an epiphany? Maybe avoid that phrase because it comes from this man. Epiphanes, which means God manifest. He was telling people he was God manifested, which again later on would be Jesus. manifested as a human, God as a human. This is something throughout ancient culture that has always been talked about, and this man is claiming to be that man on the seat of the throne of what will eventually be Jesus, God's throne, sacrificing a pig. Just the blasphemies on blasphemies. And it would ignite. Remember when Jesus in Matthew 24, and I'm going to go to the next slide here. Well, actually, no, I won't. Remember Jesus in Matthew 24 when he quotes this event and he says, when you see this, disciples, you tell people this, write this one down. When you see this event, again, he's placing this event in the future. And he's quoting this event and he says, when you see this again, if you live in Judea, flee Jerusalem. Get out. Run to the hills. You need to leave right now, because what happens next, and I'm going to skip a slide, right when he does this, in the next 3 days, is one of the worst historical massacres of the Jewish people. It's reminiscent of the Holocaust. It's horrific, and it's a complete injustice. In 3 days, over 80,000 people, roughly, are gone, either by a violent end or by captivity. Again, fulfilling prophecies about this event. And I have it written here. If you read the book of Maccabees or in other accounts, there's really no specific number that we can really point to by the end of his time as ruler about how many actually would perish, but it's a lot. And if in 3 days it's 80,000, we can assume it's probably over 100,000 as far as the 3 years are concerned. It's in the hundreds of thousands. Horrific. I won't even get into the details of what's happening here. Besides the unaliving and the captivity, you can fill in with your own imagination. I don't recommend it, but if you know anything about world history and about World War II, it's a lot like that. Technically on a smaller scale, because Hitler would eclipse that. Nero would eclipse this. It's always progressing, guys. The labor pains are always getting worse. Of course, let me go back a slide. When we go back to verses 32 to 35, it talks about this, what is actually pronounced in the Aramaic as masculine. This is the Daniel 11's masculine. This is one of my favorite prophecies in the Bible. And it's an ultimately eschatological. And I have pictures here of the Maccabean revolt. Matthias, that's kind of his ancient image up there in the top right. Big, long, burly beard, shouting freedom. And my understanding of this is a little loose. I've only recently skimmed through the book of Maccabees. I'm going to probably go through that more intensely here in the near future. I think it'll help us out. But I personally believe, I'm going to tell you this now. We're going to talk about this. Excuse me. I'm going to talk about this later on when we get back to our book of Revelation series, The Two Witnesses. I believe this is talking about the two witnesses. I believe it's the first prophecy about them, at least in detail, that I've recognized. But those who have insight among the people will give understanding to many, yet they will fall by the sword and flame. This sounds so much like the book of Revelation, the two witnesses, when they eventually are persecuted by the Antichrist. And I say here, I do think this is most immediately referring to believers in Israel, but also Gentiles who are grafted in, living among the nations, helping people and other Gentiles and in Jews in our community understand this is what was spoken of by the prophet so-and-so. Just as it was before when they could quote prophecy and say this was that, we will be able to do the same. Again, I'm a post-trib guy. I believe we'll be here doing these kinds of things among the nations. All right. Here's my last slide, right? Oh, I have one more. Here's my last slide for this teaching, or this Bible study, if you will. So here on the left, I have I wonder if I'm in reverse. I actually don't know which way I'm pointing. I'm sorry, guys. This is a new setup for me. But on the left of your screen, you have, and I might just put this one up in front of you and kind of hide my face for a second. But on the left, I have prophecies that Antiochus fulfilled. And it's not actually a limited list. I just kind of put these out there. You can go into more and more detail. The deeper you look at this stuff, the details get crazy. But he would indeed usurp the throne using statecraft and sudden military conquest. That's a prophecy. He would invade Egypt, the king of the south, twice, but he doesn't do it a third time. Speaking of Daniel 11, verses 40 through 45, there's prophecies in that section, and maybe I should put them on here. Go and read that. He doesn't do any of Daniel 11, 40 through 45. So for hyper-preterists, or for preterists who think all of prophecy's been fulfilled, Daniel 11, verse 40 through 45 would disagree with you. That's never been fulfilled at all by anybody. Neither has Daniel 12. You can spiritualize it all you want, but these prophecies are literal in that they will happen, literally. Anyway, back to this slide. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm about to get into our next topic, or at least introduce it. But you see on the left some of the things he did indeed do. I even have at the very bottom the head wound and death, albeit this was just a rumor in Israel going around. But if you look at the right, and I already mentioned Daniel 11, 40 through 45, but there's other things he just doesn't do. The day counts in Daniel 8. We're given day counts of 1290 and 1335. We're also given day counts 2300 evenings and mornings. Now, these prophecies would seemingly happen, but the day counts are completely off. I'd say completely off, almost by 200 days, like 150 to 200 days. Antiochus also, he doesn't reign for times and half a time, for 3.5 years, or 1260 days that we read in the book of Revelation, which, by the way, the day gap of 30 days, 1260 to 1290, another topic we'll be covering in the future. But he falls short. And I've heard some people say, well, does prophecy have to be accurate? In order for God to prove himself in those days, yes, God has to be accurate. He's either sovereign or he's not. And if he's giving us day counts and they fall short of the day counts, then God got it wrong. God doesn't get things wrong. When God says something will be according to how he says it, it will be according to how he says it. So the day counts. Antiochus IV just doesn't do that. The 3.5 years, he actually does about 3 years and 10 days of this particular time of Jacob's trouble. He also doesn't invade. This is coming from Daniel 11, 40 through 45. He doesn't invade Egypt a third time, because in that prophecy, the Antichrist comes a third time. This is where partial preterists would say these scriptures are about the Antichrist, but everything else has been fulfilled. I can see why you might think that, but here in the future, I think you'll start doubting that idea altogether. I don't believe that at all. I think it's completely wrong, but you can be forgiven if that's all you've been taught, because it seems to make sense until you really peer deeper under the hood. So he was, as I was saying, he was close in a number of things, but he wasn't quite there. I'm going to end that there. It's a shorter video than it was in part 1. Up next is going to be episode 3, and then we're just going to continue from there. I'm not even going to call them episodes at this point. It's just going to be new videos, and I'm going to start putting up. I don't think I'll do them weekly. News coming out of the Middle East can be hard to come by in a reliable fashion, but we're going to continue this. We're going to keep a sharp eye, because if you look at this map on the right, I'm going to get myself out of the way again. The province of Idlib, which is in the northwestern quadrant of Syria on the map, right there in front of the border of the most southern tip of Turkey, is roughly, it's not exactly, but it's roughly the area of ancient Antioch. Antioch. This is where the capital, where Antiochus Epiphanes IV would control first, coming from Pergamon that we talked about earlier. It's essentially the same area where his forces would come from. And the events back in December took me by surprise. It took really the world by surprise. It was a huge deal, and suddenly nobody's talking about it, which is, anytime something major happens and the news is there and then they go hush, like just out of nowhere, they just hush on it. To me, that's alarming. I do not trust the media. I don't trust CNN. I don't trust MSNBC. I don't really trust Fox either. I don't trust them. So you might say, well, then how are you going to get your news? Well, it's going to be difficult. Sometimes you have to look beyond the article and the title. I also have a couple other news sources that are a little under the radar. I might try to figure out how to share them Some of this I get from FAI on their, because they have people in the Middle East, and you can follow them on Twitter. I don't have informants in the area, but I know people who do. Well, I don't know them personally, but there are people who do. And together, we're going to just keep a watch on these events. Because not only was this a historical conquest of the city of Damascus and the rest of Syria by this individual named Al-Jilani and his organization HTS, the dynamics at play politically concerning Turkey and Egypt and Israel and Iran are rather interesting. And I've shown a map in other videos about how the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasty, the kingdoms of the north and the kingdoms of the south, very much reflect the geopolitical structure of the Middle East and North Africa today in their involvement with Israel. You have the Abrahamic Accords, and including Saudi Arabia, the Arab nations really mirroring the Ptolemaic regions in their, I would say, protagonist views towards Israel. Sometimes what they say in news articles, you can kind of throw to the wayside. They're friends under the table, and it's been because of this nation, Iran, or the Ayatollahs in Iran. They have a common enemy. Nothing like a common enemy to unite a people. Go and study World War II if you don't believe me. What's that Winston Churchill said? War makes interesting bedfellows, I think is the quote. I think that's Winston Churchill. That's what you're seeing in the Middle East now. And then you have the antagonistic nations. Think Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, very much mirroring the Seleucid kingdom during this time. So we're going to get into that in the next episode. We'll go through scripture and we'll talk about, because this is true, how some of the earliest prophecies are seemingly being fulfilled. And I say seemingly because here's the kicker. We won't know for sure we're in the end times until there's a temple, a third temple, according to the prophet Daniel in Daniel 8, with sacrifices. They are today, I mean, they've been talking about this for a long time, but since October 7th, 2023, since that horrific event, there has been increased activity of prayer on the Temple Mount, which is, it's modern days, that's historic. That's not something you see without people getting unalived or complete riots and just terrible things happening as a result. But people are openly, Jewish people and some Christians, I think, if what I've heard correct, are openly praying on the Temple Mount, and they're not being arrested. They're not being removed. Maybe in some instances they are, but in a lot of instances they aren't. And with the political shift happening in the West, specifically in the United States, where there's a prominent individual coming into, I think, Secretary of Defense, who has openly stated that Israel deserves to have a temple. And Israel itself has their own politicians that are trying to move this forward. So with all that being said, we're going to start keeping an eye on these events together. Now, while we are keeping watch, keep this in mind. No matter what we see, no matter what you're going through, Jesus went through it as well. He was a man of many sorrows, well acquainted with grief. You can substitute depression and things like that. Now, he never caved to these things. We're human. Like, we cave to this stuff sometimes. I myself have wrestled with depression for a long time, and I've had times where I've just caved in and just like, man, and isolated and just cut myself off. Jesus would experience these same things, but he would never cave. And this is what makes him so special to us, that he did this and conquered the world for us. He's going to return one day. Every promise he ever made will be completed. And we'll say that. I honestly believe we'll say that when we see him. We'll say, wow, you kept every promise you ever made, and you were worth every tear and every second that we waited. We're so glad you're here. Yay, let's party and have a feast. He is coming. He's with you now, and he's also coming. So with that, I'll end up with the word Maranatha. I love you guys. Stay tuned.